Welcome to part 8 of my narration and commentary on the Bob Black essay, The Abolition of Work. For those of you who have been following this entire series, my deepest condolences. Even with my pedantry and OCD, I'm getting bored of this. But with the entire script now sitting at 38 single-spaced pages, 21,500 words, I am finally reaching my end. This essay has led my mind in many interesting directions. It's introduced me to many new thinkers, so I think it was worth it. And now, being a Canadian stuck in South Africa due to the new variant Omicron, I have the time to indulge myself. So with no further ado, let's get going on the penultimate video in this series, bringing this chapter of the Pernicious Chattel channel to a close. Quote, "Third, other things being equal, some things that are unsatisfying if done by yourself or in unpleasant surroundings or at the orders of an overlord are enjoyable, at least for a while if these circumstances are changed. This is probably true to some extent of all work. People deploy their otherwise wasted ingenuity to make a game of the least inviting drudge jobs as best they can. Activities that appeal to some people don't always appeal to all others, but everyone, at least potentially, has a variety of interests and an interest in variety. As the saying goes, anything once." Fourier was the master at speculating how aberrant and perverse penchants could be put to use in post-civilized society, what he called harmony. He thought that the Emperor Nero would have turned out all right if, as a child, he could have indulged his taste for bloodshed by working in a slaughterhouse. Small children who notoriously relish wallowing in filth could be organized in little hordes to clean toilets and empty the garbage, with medals awarded for the outstanding. I'm not arguing for these precise examples, but for the underlying principle, which I think makes perfect sense as one dimension of an overall revolutionary transformation. Bear in mind that we don't have to take today's work just as we find it and match it up with the proper people, some of whom would have to be perverse indeed. If technology has a role in all this, it is less to automate work out of existence than to open up new realms for recreation. To some extent, we may want to return to handicraft, which William Morris considered a probable and desirable upshot of communist revolution. Art would be taken back from the snobs and collectors, abolished as a specialized department catering to an elite audience, and its quality of beauty and creation restored to integral life from which they were stolen by work. It's a sobering thought that the Grecian urns that we write odes about and showcase in museums were used in their own time to store olive oil. I doubt our everyday artifacts will fare as well in the future, if there is one. The point is that there's no such thing as progress in the world of work. If anything, it's just the opposite. We shouldn't hesitate to pilfer the past for what it has to offer. The ancients lose nothing, yet we're enriched." Close quote. It seems evident that Bob likes the ideas of Charles Fourier and William Morris regarding how to change work from horrifyingly dull wage labor into a willingly chosen activity resembling play. This idea probably seems utter nonsense to anyone who believes that humans, in their natural state, are lazy. I'd argue, based on both my experience and my research, that humans are far from naturally lazy. Human beings in their natural state are extremely industrious and hardworking. Left to their own devices, they will create, they'll build, they'll cooperate, and they will respond to social need by applying their energy to assist others. But this is only part of a very complicated set of human behaviors dependent on both nature and nurture, as well as health. There's a great deal of observable laziness all around us, but given that humans are not machines, how much of this laziness is due to either work-induced depression or simple exhaustion? The human body is hardwired to be lazy when physical and mental resources are low. On the other hand, when a human is well rested, and especially when a person has experienced the mental rewards of being active, our dominating motivation is to be active. There is also a well-established link between mental health and work motivation. So Bob isn't postulating some wild idea. Yet, we need to recognize that the distribution of motivation and laziness will not be constant across the population. Just as mental health varies across the population, so will motivation. This raises a few questions for me. Without the incentives that we've been accustomed to, how many people would struggle in a post-work world? How many people, freed from all constraints, will fail to fully utilize their time to anyone's benefit? Would a certain percentage of the population suffer in this type of society? We've been brainwashed, we've been punished, we've been subjected to subtle and extreme pressure to work the way we do now. We are not the same culture or the same people who went through the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. I wonder how we would, as a society, ever accomplish anything like mass conversion to some other way of organizing ourselves. Would a potentially large portion of the population actually dislike the challenge of being truly free? I think Bob's reference to Fourier's children wallowing in filth idea is telling. It's not an idea that I would have included, given that I'm just not sure that children liking to play in the mud is comparable to lowering one on a rope into a cesspit. But also the idea that if Nero could only have been allowed barbarism as a child, then he'd somehow be free of his homicidal insanity. Whether our picture of Nero is true or a fabrication of subsequent Romans, I can't accept this analogy as being true. I don't see any scientific relation between childhood indulgences and later pathological behavior. It's not to say that a bad childhood can't bring out the murderous in many of us, but it just isn't as simple as Fourier suggests. To be practical, there was a concept in Fourier's thought that I think might need to be added to Bob's list of recommendations. Fourier had included incentives in living conditions and in pay for people willing to take on unpleasant tasks. I think this might become somewhat necessary. I can see an individual or small community maintaining their own sewers, for instance. Simple necessity would drive that. But with nearly 8 billion of us on the planet, I don't think large, difficult to maintain infrastructure can be done away with altogether. This raises the question, who is going to do the work to clean and repair sewers? Who is going to clean the streets? Who is going to maintain power grids, at least as we roll out less cumbersome local systems? Are we always going to need a group of well-educated and trained individuals who are willing to take on the nasty tasks that are necessary for our communities to operate? The only way I can see to make this happen is if you incentivize these people. Of course, it need not be forced. It need not be based on exploitation. It need not be based on a 40-hour work week with a meager 2-week holiday annually. A much more relaxed and fun society could, with some convincing, allow people to earn more on the basis that they do what no one else is willing to. William Morris, 1834 to 1896, was a British textile designer, poet, artist, novelist, printer, translator, and social activist associated with the British arts and crafts movement. He was a major contributor to the revival of traditional British textile arts and methods of production. His literary contributions helped to establish the modern fantasy genre, while he helped win acceptance of socialism in fin de siècle Great Britain. Unlike most of the references in Bob's essays, Morris is not a theorist. He was more of a Renaissance man involved in so many different forms of art. However, Morris did explicitly reject the products of the Industrial Revolution and profoundly disliked 19th century capitalism. His art was more often than not hand-produced, smaller volume, and extremely high quality. His focus was on producing beauty in everything he created. He is reported saying that a man should have nothing in his home that wasn't in itself beautiful. In this, he was rejecting the utilitarian ideas that dominated his age. He was one of the earliest environmentalists. Morris is obviously referenced in Bob's essay because he rejected the family business he was born into, rather pursuing with great acclaim those activities that interested him. He was a man of passionate activity and occupied himself with things he loved. Of course, he wasn't, as none of us really are, a self-made man. He has been described as born into a wealthy, middle-class family, which sounds like a contradiction. But what I assume is that this description means that his parents were stupid rich, but had not ascended to royalty. He's very important in the lineage of ideas that inspired Bob, influenced later communists, socialists, and anarchists, especially in the idea that human work need not be stultifying drudgery to produce cheap and ugly yet useful things. Quote, "The reinvention of daily life means marching off the edge of our maps. There is, it is true, more suggestive speculation than most people suspect. Besides Fourier and Morris, and even a hint here and there in Marx, there are the writings of Kropotkin, the syndicalists Petard and Puget, anarco-communists Old, Berkman, and New, Bookchin. The Goodman brothers, Communitas, is exemplary for illustrating what forms from given functions or purposes, and there is something to be gleaned from the often hazy heralds of alternate, appropriate, intermediate, convivial technology, like Schumacher and especially Illich, once you disconnect their fog machines. The situationists, as represented by Van Eyme's Revolution of Everyday Life and in Situationist International Anthology, are so ruthlessly lucid as to be exhilarating, even if they never did quite square the endorsements of the rule of the workers' councils with the abolition of work. Better their incongruity, though, than any extant version of leftism, whose devotees look to be the last champions of work. For if there was no work, there would be no workers, and without workers, who would the left have to organize?" Close quote. So I guess some who's who of this list of people is necessary, both for my audience's edification as well as my own. So in the order that Bob has listed them, let's start with the Emils. Emile Petard, 1869 to 1935, Emile Puget, 1860 to 1931. Both these men were anarchic-syndicalists, which, aside from being a difficult word to say, is also a $100 word to describe trade unionists with big ideas. Petard was secretary of the Electrical Industries Union in France in the early part of the 20th century. Puget was vice secretary of the French General Confederation of Labor, also in the early part of the 20th century. I found easy references for both, but unfortunately the Petard reference is in French, so although I tried to read it and understood more than I expected, I may misrepresent his beliefs. Both men were on the hard left of politics, with Puget being a non-authoritarian communist or anarco-communist. And while his politics were Marxist, he used anarchic-syndicalist tactics in his labor activism. Petard was more aligned with anarchic-syndicalist beliefs. This is a belief that revolutionary industrial unionism or syndicalism as a method for workers in capitalist society to gain control of an economy and thus control broader society. The end goal of syndicalism is to abolish the wage system, regarding it as wage slavery. Anarco-syndicalist theory, therefore, generally focuses on the labor movement. Now, I'm far from an expert and frankly not really interested in all the competing flavors of anarchism, but in essence, I can see how the ultimate aims of some labor activists fit nicely into an anti-work system. Alexander Berkman, 1870 to 1936, was a Russian-American anarchist and author. He was a leading member of the anarchist movement in the 20th century and is famous for his political activism and his writing. He managed to get himself into quite a bit of trouble in the US, first trying to assassinate a businessman and then for conspiracy against the draft. He was deported to Russia, where he initially supported the Bolshevik Revolution, but he later became disillusioned about the use of terror and repression against fellow revolutionaries. He finally settled in France to write, and committed suicide in 1936. Murray Bookchin, 1921 to 2006, is an American communalist, political philosopher, trade union organizer, and an educator. He was an anarchist, but he renounced that and created communalism. He decided that modern American anarchists were essentially just selfish individualists. He was a very important influence on the modern environmentalist movement, on the anti-globalism movement, on Occupy Wall Street, and on the New Left. Also, interestingly, and I think after Bob's essay was written, Bookchin and Bob have a notorious written spat, both being critical of the other. The brothers, Percival and Paul Goodman, an architect and a humanist respectively, co-authored Communitas. The idea developed from Percy's exhibition concept for a city of tomorrow, which he had unsuccessfully proposed for Otis Elevator at the 1939 World's Fair. The book outlines how urban planning can be used to develop better and more integrated societies. Finally, the Situationists and Situationists International are an international organization of social revolutionaries made up of avant-garde artists, intellectuals, and political theorists active between 1957 and 1971. They were influenced by libertarian communists, who I'd argue were just communists who wanted to skip all of the dictatorship of the proletariat stuff, get on to the utopian vision that Marx had for a future social paradise. Personally, it sounds pretty good. The Soviet Union without Lenin, Stalin, the party, the KGB sounds much more attractive than the reality ever was. I did some reading about situationist thinking, but came out highly confused. Lots of quote-unquote revolutionary languages is used, it's overly complex, and it's incredibly difficult to read. As best as I can understand Van Imme's writings, it seems to be focused on people developing their individualism against capitalist-imposed homogeneity. That people can create or build a life that is free, and that life will have to flout stereotyped conventions. Quote, so the abolitionists would be largely on their own. No one can say what would result from unleashing the creative power stultified by work. Anything can happen. The tiresome debater's problem of freedom versus necessity, with its theological overtones, resolves itself practically once the production and use values is coextensive with the consumption of delightful play activity. Life will become a game, or rather many games, but not, as it is now, a zero-sum game. An optimal sexual encounter is the paradigm of productive play. The participants potentiate each other's pleasures. Nobody keeps score and everybody wins. The more you give, the more you get. In the ludic life, the best of sex will diffuse into the better part of daily life. Generalized play leads to the libidinization of life. Sex, in turn, can become less urgent and desperate, more playful. If we play our cards right, we can all get more out of life than we put into it. But only if we play for keeps. No one should ever work. Workers of the world, relax. Close quote. And so this essay closes. In the summer, I think Bob takes a clear stand with Fourier, aligning his wishes for a post-work society as one ruled by passions. One where each person following their passion necessarily supports one another, and society becomes a set of cooperative relationships that are based on consensual activity. In a way, it's somewhat reminiscent of basic capitalist theory, that each person pursuing their own interests creates the best outcome for everyone. Except that, of course, in capitalism it isn't at all true. Instead, there is endless exploitation and force in many, if not most, community relationships. Where I do stop being comfortable with Bob is that I'm completely unsure of how we would ever get from here to there. That while there are many who could decide to do like I've done and quit their jobs, cut their expenses, and focus on less consumption and more freedom, there are also a significant number of people who are too poor, and cutting consumption and cutting their expectations just isn't a reasonable way to stop their dependence on wage labor. There would still need to be some redistribution of resources that allows everyone to reach a basic level. How that is to come about isn't clear in this essay. then this isn't a full anarchist plan for a better future. It's just an attack on our current attitudes about work and an attempt to raise people's awareness that an alternative might be very attractive. In this limited goal, Bob is completely successful. He has demonstrated that there is a long line of very intelligent people who have been pointing out work is shit. He has demonstrated that our current life and its assumptions about people are not some incontestable reality we just have to get used to. We don't need to force people to work, and we don't need to accept the level of duress that we all put up with. There is an alternative to consider, and maybe, just maybe, humanity's future is much brighter if we all learn to relax and stop trying so hard. Thanks so much for joining me on this long slog through this essay. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope that you join me in future episodes. This is XCG, wishing you all the very best on your journey to freedom.